With that, we're going to move on and we're going to introduce Mitchell Diamond. Now, he's going to talk about the problem of consciousness. Mitch has researched and studied the biology of human behavior as an avocation since he first read The Naked Ape in high school. The colloquial term for such non-academic study is independent research. He observed that the more science learns about human and animal biology, including behavior, the smaller the distinctions between humans and animals become. So let's welcome Mitchell Diamond, please.
Hello. Can you hear? Oh, there we are. First, I want to thank Scott and Brian for having me, for letting me talk and give this presentation, and to all of you for showing up. So let's get into it. What is the problem with consciousness? Well, the first issue is, of course, what does it mean? So it means many things to many people. But for me, I'm using it to mean the cognitive features that differentiate humans from other animals. We're special, or at least we think we are. So some of the features or characteristics that people associate with consciousness this way is self-awareness, thinking and self-reflection, access to vast historical memory, choice and decision-making, logic and rationality, hyper-learning. We are capable of learning an immense amount, at least we think, compared to other animals. However, in all cases, these features of consciousness do not perform the way we believe they do, or at least partly. What consciousness is good for? Consciousness is a good thing. It makes us human. It gives us all the advantages and opportunities in the culture that we have. It reduces dependency on instinct and hands over a greater portion of behavior to learning and culture. It enables and supports context-dependent information that is true temporarily, locally, or contingently. What does that mean? It means that humans in the jungle, or in the desert, or in the tundra of the Arctic, can all have cultural adaptations that are specific to their situation and to their time that allows them to live there, as opposed to most animals who are dependent almost entirely on instinct and cannot adapt to these different situations. They're stuck, and when their environment changes, they're in big trouble. So consciousness is evolutionarily adaptive and advantageous because it provides flexibility, creativity, and foresight. That's the good stuff. But as with most things, there's the good and the bad. Consciousness is not all that. So evolution progresses as a series of compromises. So I'm going to give you an example of a compromise in human evolution, which is human childbirth. Because the big brain and upright walking is so important to our evolution and our success, we have a big brain and we're upright walking. But there's a consequence, and that consequence is there's a very high mortality rate for childbirth, both to the mother and the child, relative to other animals. That's the opposite reaction, if you will, the equal and opposite reaction from the second law of thermodynamics, whatever. You know what I'm talking about. So consciousness is like that as well. There is a good aspect to consciousness, but there's a negative or downside to consciousness. Only a small percentage of the information consciousness provides promotes flexibility, creativity, learning, and culture, but that small amount is enough to preserve its adaptiveness. It's enough to have evolved and continue to be an important influence in human behavior. The self-aware perceived importance of consciousness, however, makes people believe they are in control and directing their own movie when they are not, for the most part. Why do I say that? First, I'm going to list what I consider to be, or not I got this from, and by the way, all this stuff can be found in research articles and studies if you want. And I'll have at the end a list of people, and I can point you to any of the evidence that supports this. Conscious introspection of one's own behavior is often wrong or false. People invent false explanations and convenient rationalizations to justify beliefs. Scott was just pointing out a few of those. Consciousness is latent in the flow of time and is not the initiator of action, for the most part. Brain activation for an action starts significantly before conscious awareness of the decision to act. The decision to act comes after the unconscious decision to act. Consciousness assigns itself the role of activator when it is not. We falsely believe our own conscious intention. Our sense of conscious volition is a trick of consciousness, which puts consciousness in this very weird position of being delusion, or a trickster, if you will. We believe that it is what allows us to make decisions and control what we do, and yet evidence shows it's not the case. Consciousness sometimes gets in the way and distracts and detracts. So, first example of what I'm going to talk about is the split brain experiments. How many people are familiar with the split brain experiments? Oh, a good amount of you, that's great. So, Sperry, Gazzaniga, Milner, some of the researchers, Sperry's the lead researcher, in the 1960s at Caltech. So what they did is they performed a commissuriectomy, which splits the corpus callosum, this band of nerves that connects the left and right hemispheres. And they did that because people who suffered epilepsy, severe epilepsy, this is a way to isolate the so-called neural storm of epilepsy, and it actually helped improve their lives. However, they wanted to know, did this cutting of the corpus callosum have an effect on their cognitive and behavioral behavior? So, to talk to them after the surgery, just casually, they would look as normal as anybody else. There was nothing obviously different about them. However, they did these studies where they were able to flash information to one hemisphere. So when they flashed the word face to just the left hemisphere, which is the hemisphere that has the language modules like the Wernicke's area and Broca's area, the person said face. However, when they flashed the word face to the right hemisphere, which was not the language hemisphere, and because their corpus callosum had been cut, that information could not be transferred over to the left hemisphere, and asked what they saw. They said nothing, or they sometimes even made up stuff, but they couldn't say the thing they were looking at. However, the right hemisphere controls the left hand, and they were able to draw the thing they were looking at. However, they were not able to voice it. It's interesting, actually. This is just a kick my ass. When I first learned this in college, it's like, holy Christ. So, there's a lot of great stories that end up coming out of this study, or series of studies, but I just want to play, this is Brenda Milner, who is one of the researchers at that time, and this is an interview she did. I just want to play a little excerpt from that, which talks about one of her experiences with these people.
His introductory lectures about these patients. They have this setup where they can flash images briefly into one hemisphere for such a short time that you can't move your eyes, and so you can be sure that the image has gone into one hemisphere. And he would flash pictures, slightly suggestive, sexy pictures into the right hemisphere. This young woman, NG, she blushed a little. Of course, emotion can get transmitted by lower centers that are not separated. You see, so the patient probably felt a bit uncomfortable, whatever. And the left hemisphere says, "Oh, Dr. Sperry, what a strange machine you have there," or something. Or makes a comment about the machine or what Sperry was doing, because it obviously had no idea of what actually had happened. Did not have access, but had access to the emotion, you know, and was rationalizing, trying to understand the way she was feeling, I suppose.
So that was Brenda Milner, who was part of that experimental research team. So I wanted you to have the opportunity to hear it in your own words. So some people have criticized these studies to say that this is really an issue of language as opposed to consciousness. But I don't think so. So there's another example of many brain lesions and problems that people have that indicate that it's not just language, that there's something more related to awareness that's going on here. So there's this particular type of blindness called blind sight. I'm just going to read this fellow Wisecrans in England who discovered it, and it'll explain what's going on here. Wisecrans showed the patient a spot of light in the blind region and asked what he saw. The patient said nothing, as would be expected, but then he asked the patient to reach out and touch the light. But I can't see it, said the patient. How do you expect me to point to it? Wisecrans said to try it anyway. Take a guess. To the researcher's surprise, the patient reached out and pointed accurately to the dot that he could not consciously perceive. After hundreds of trials, it became obvious that he could point with 99% accuracy, even though he claimed on each trial that he was just guessing. What's going on here? The eye, the optic nerve, and the visual cortex all work. The sensory message in the occipital lobe in the rear, where the visual processing is done, it's there, it works, and then it goes forward. Here's the motor cortex over the top, gets there so that the person can point. It all works. However, the visual signal doesn't get to the higher or consciousness centers, which we generally think of as the prefrontal cortex, although it's hard to know exactly. There is no center of consciousness. But we tend to think that the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, is where these things need to get to in order to become aware, that we become aware of these things. So here's another example where functionally it work, but they believe they're blind. And it's really good. So now I'm going to move to this other idea, which is that consciousness is always behind time, the real time, waiting for the train. So Benjamin Libet at UC San Francisco, again in, I think it was the 60s, showed that the brain initiates a movement at least 350 milliseconds before a person decides to move, and decides in quote meaning their conscious intention to move. That's about a third of a second. So the bottom readiness potential, RP, is what he's measuring here. And so let's look at what this chart is telling us. The W says awareness of intention. That means the conscious awareness of a person's decision to act, to push a button. I decide at this moment to push a button. And then here is the actual button push itself at time 0. So what he's measuring, he's putting electrodes on the scalp of the subjects. He's observing that there's this rise in the readiness potential a third of a second, it's beginning a third of a second, before the actual conscious intention or decision to push the button. So there's something happening in the brain before the actual button push, or I should say before the actual decision to push the button, suggesting that there's some unconscious activity going on that happens before consciousness, and it's not consciousness itself that is the decider in this case. It's only informing the person that they've decided. Now, there's a lot of criticism of this study. How do we know that these things are actually happening at these times? How do we know exactly when the awareness of intention takes place? So I wanted to show you a critique of Libet. And I'm not going to read all this business. I'm just going to give you the summary of it. And so someone else, a number of other researchers come along and they say, in contradiction to Libet, early stages of action follow the conscious experience of deciding, rather than preceding it. Their conclusion is that consciousness kicks off the action. So they're contradicting Libet. So what do you do with that information? Research methodology is critical but difficult to evaluate. And I put the asterisk there. We're going to come back and look at this later on in a different way. But it's hard. Science is hard. How do we know which it is? And so these are the really good stuff of science, is to get into these issues and to look at the methodologies. But boy, when you look at this stuff, it's like, oh my God, how do you figure this stuff out? So now I'm going to switch to this thing called cognitive biases. The idea being that, let's see, well, let me get into this. So most human behavior, I claim, and many people claim, is driven by emotionally based biases, predispositions, and prejudices. And we certainly, again, when Scott gives his great talks before, when we get started, we see a lot of that stuff, don't we? Thousands of studies show people make judgments and act based on heuristics or common sense principles, intuitions, educated guesses, and rules of thumb. And so I'm saying that these characteristics are not evidence of conscious considerations, of introspection, of weighing pros and cons. These are things that people tend to be conditioned to as they grow up. And I think even in some cases they're even genetic, but we don't have to go there. That's a little bit controversial. The point is, people have these emotionally based reactions that are not considered in what we would call a rational kind of way. Wikipedia lists 167 types of cognitive biases. So let's look at some examples. In the online tease to this meeting on Meetup, talked about why do people vote against their best interests? Well, I'm not going to answer that directly, but I'll give you some suggestions. The candidate listed first on the ballot gets a 2% benefit attributed to the primacy effect, a type of cognitive bias in which the first instance or event is preferred. Now, it happens that in at least a lot of elections, they are mixing up the order of the candidates because of this particular bias. They recognize this as a problem. By the way, 2% benefit changes the outcome of a lot of elections. After the first televised presidential debate in 1960, among radio listeners, Nixon won the debate by more than a 2-to-1 margin. But among the far greater number of television viewers, Kennedy beat him. It was believed, because Kennedy looked better on TV, while Nixon's deeper voice sounded better. And perhaps Kennedy's Boston accent was not as favorable. But, of course, it didn't change what they said. Their policies, regardless of which avenue you get to them, TV or radio, they say the same thing, yet people have a different opinion based on these other, what are really amount to unconscious influences. A study of the 1974 Canadian national elections found that the most attractive candidates received over twice as many votes as the least attractive ones. Now, it's possible that in this case, the more attractive candidates had better policy positions, were better candidates, so, maybe that's interesting. So here's another unrelated study. Pictures and policy positions of fake candidates were presented to volunteer voter subjects. Prior to these voter subjects, candidates' pictures were pre-assessed for able-looking, whatever able-looking means, which presumably to me means leadership-looking. But there's a different group of people who judged those pictures. Then they take these voter subjects and they mix the able-looking and less able-looking with the Democrats and Republicans. So you have half of the able-looking having liberal Democratic positions and half the able-looking having Republican conservative positions, so that the influence of political belief is negated. And what you get, of course, is that 59% of the votes went to the able-looking faces and 41% went to the less able-looking. It didn't, well, to some people, their positions, their policies mattered. But to a great number of people, they got hooked into the way they looked. That's unconscious. Because when you act, well, okay, let me, before I jump the gun here. Now, we're going to talk about science and scientists. Could that possibly happen to them? In science, where objectivity is valued, it's often clear that people's views are highly correlated to their vested interests. So, some years ago, some decades ago, there was a debate about how the universe began. Did it begin with the steady state theory, which suggested the universe had always been around, or was it the Big Bang, in which the cosmos began at time zero? After the Big Bang theory went out, a steady state researcher proclaimed 3 years later, the universe, in fact, is a botched job, but I suppose you shall have to make the best of it. What does that mean? It's like the universe is wrong for the way it created itself? I don't get it. Well, I sort of do get it, but it's kind of sad. 30 years later, another leading steady-state theorist, by then old and retired, still believed in a modified version of his steady-state theory, which led someone else to suggest that science advances funeral by funeral. One more on this story of the objectivity in science. So this is a study, again, one of those controlled studies where you take grad student volunteers, and in this case, unbeknownst to them, phony research reports dealing with issues in which they already had an opinion were presented to them, and they were asked to judge. Half saw data that supported one side, while the other half saw data that supported the opposite position. However, the research methodology was identical in both cases, and I think you know where this is going to go. Subjects favorably judged the studies that supported their beliefs. The effect was stronger for those with strong prior beliefs. When asked, most subjects denied that their assessment of the research depended on whether the data supported their prior opinion. But they were wrong. I want to point out that this is something that happens in a lot of studies. I mean, there's thousands of studies out there in various ways that deal with people's biases. So, for instance, in terms of studying, are people influenced by advertising? Are they influenced by propaganda, political and otherwise? They always deny that they're influenced. But of course, when you do the study this way, they're always influenced. Sometimes you'll ask them, were you influenced by these things? And they'll say, I wasn't. I understand that everybody else in the study was. Scientists and everybody else with an investment in an established theory stubbornly cling to their beliefs even in the face of contrary evidence. So now we're again switching a little bit when consciousness gets in the way. First example is the flow versus consciousness. How many are familiar with the concept of flow? A few people. It's this idea that when, I'll just read it here, athletes, musicians, dancers, and others describe when they perform at their highest level as being in a state of flow. And this is, I'm going to read some ways that people describe how they feel when they're in a sense of flow. Highly focused, loss of ego, loss of self-consciousness, sense of time is distorted, transcendence of individuality, description, well, so let's stop right there. So a lot of you, I know some of the people I've actually talked to here, for instance, if you're a musician, in order to play music well, you can't think too much, because if you're thinking, you're just going to get in the way of your own ability to play. It's the same with athletics. The best athletes don't think, they act. And they act out of there's a lot of practice behind it, but it's that practice that makes it happen. That practice is not so much consciousness happening, it's the building the muscle memory, if you will. So, all right, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Thinking gets in the way of performance. Muscle memory bypasses awareness and introspection, results in superior outcomes, at least in terms of flow. Consciousness can direct or motivate at a superficial level, but the real work to learn or achieve happens outside of consciousness. And then there's another example of how consciousness gets in the way. This is another college student relationship study, or not, another college study, shall we say, about relationships. They took a bunch of college students who were in romantic or committed relationships. And they divided them into two groups, the analyzers and the non-analyzers. The analyzers, they asked to think about your relationship in detail. Why it is you're in this relationship, how good is it, where's it going? As opposed to non-analyzers, they just didn't have to deal with that. So what happens, the analyzers tended to change their attitudes toward their relationships from their original attitude. That might be okay. It's not good or bad at this point, but it turns out the analyzers did a poorer job of predicting the longevity of their relationship than the non-analyzers. And after all the study, and this is actually when you do the thousands of studies on thinking versus feeling in various ways, the scientists decided or came to the conclusion people construct a new story about their feelings based on the reasons that happen to come to mind. And I'm just going to read a little bit more of their conclusion. People brought to mind reasons that conform to their cultural and personal theories about why people love others and that happen to be on their minds. The reasons people gave bore almost no relationship to how happy they said they were with their relationship a few weeks earlier. But because people do not recognize this fact, they assume that the reasons are an accurate reflection of their feelings, leading to an attitude change. All right, we're wrapping up here. The illusion of objectivity, introspection as a deceit. All people tenaciously hold on to their beliefs regardless of evidence. Knowledge and opinions are rationalized to fit bias and belief. In typical studies, this is great, 90% of subjects believe they are above average in intelligence, skills, empathy, whatever you happen to be studying with these people, they all think they're up there. So where are you in that? Okay. When people attribute cause to events, their accuracy is very poor. People come up with stories that make sense and can be believed, but are usually in error. Scientists who study such errors see that they are not haphazard, but are regular and systematic. Consciousness wants answers, but thousands of studies, and I've already said this, show human behavior is primarily motivated by emotionally driven, non-conscious forces, which is sometimes called emotional intelligence. And there's actually a book called Emotional Intelligence that gets into this whole business. Morality, introspection, thinking are mostly conscious rationalizations. Rationality doesn't exist as an absolute. So I know, and in fact I have this issue myself, I like to believe that I am based on science, and I know a lot of people here say the same thing, that science informs us. So I had to say, science is a methodology that relies on rules and repetition. Empiricism is self-policing by methodology, not by any essential truth, because of course, 100 years ago, things in science were way different than they are now, and in 20 and 30 and 50 years, things are going to be way different than they are now, but all we can do is deal with what we know at the moment. We can only give it the best shot we have. So, the problem with consciousness. What we call consciousness is noisy signals that occasionally provide benefit, and it does, I'm not saying it doesn't, but mostly contribute little value and often distract and get in the way. Accruing benefit from consciousness is mostly capricious and accidental. Neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran at UC San Diego says, your conscious life, in short, is nothing but an elaborate post hoc, after the fact, rationalization of things you do for other reasons. Here's a lot of the people that I've read and influence me and contribute to this. You can pick any of these folks and dive in, and they'll all have various things to say about consciousness and biases and all that business. But I wanted to show you one more thing. Let's see where we are here. Now, if you are thinking like I think about the problem with consciousness and bias, you see this stuff all the time in the media, and I just wanted to give you this one example. This was 2 days ago in Alternet. Alternet's a nice liberal website, a lot of good information. But I ran into this and it's sort of in the line of what Scott would be talking about too, since he picks on Fox News, rightly so. Citizens are misinformed, often badly so. It's going to be the first paragraph. It's not just that they lack good information, which would merely make them uninformed. They have plenty of bad information that leads them to believe untrue things, or more likely the other way around. They believe untrue things, and that leads them to collect and even invent bad information to flesh out what they already believe. This is a basic bias, and in this case, they tend to be talking about voters and then political stuff, but this is really something that applies to humanity. So, that's what I've got to say.
So I have the question microphone. Let's go right here with Mark real quick.
Thank you. I have two basic questions. One, have they done that Libet test on athletes who experience a state of flow? For instance, part of why I do sports is I experience the flow when I'm skiing. I can tell I'm in the moment, and other times. Secondly, is there any way to overcome some of these problems we have with our own biases? And then is there ways that are there ways in which we can show other people and help to change their perspectives on what they believe? What was the question?
There's three. Number one, I don't have any idea if the Libet type of work has been done with athletes. Be a great thing to do. Number two, what was the question again?
How can we overcome our own biases?
So, who's the guy that wrote the book about needing to have 10,000 hours to become an expert at something? Blackwell. Thank you. Gladwell, that's right. So, he says, I believe, that that you just have to look inside yourself, and that you can get in touch with your biases. It's a lovely thought. There's another fellow who's Robert Burton, and I forget the name of the book that he wrote, but he actually took on that Gladwell quote and said, "You're dreaming, buddy." Because this stuff is happening in your unconscious. You'd have to have it available to your consciousness to look at your biases, which isn't to say you can't do that. At least the part of your biases that you can get to at a conscious level, you can have that conversation internally. But there's a whole lot going on that's unconscious, and you can't get there. And that's what Robert Burton said. So, of course, I'm weaseling, because it depends, How many of the bias... So, here's a good example. Ferguson, Missouri, kind of in the news. I saw, and maybe some of you saw, that 37% of white people believe that racism is the basis of the problems that are going on there, right? Well, I kind of think it's obviously racism. So, now I don't mean to bring politics into that, because that goes down a hell of a black hole, but to me, the fact that only 37% of the population, the white population, thinks that racism is what's causing the problem in Ferguson, Missouri, shows a great deal of bias. And the other example related to that is Obama. A lot of people hate Obama. I mean, I remember Clinton. I'm old enough. I don't recall the visceral hate for Clinton that they have for Obama. I believe, and it's my opinion for what that's worth, it's racism, but people deny it. They deny that it's racism. And this is, we talked about this. People adjust their beliefs to fit their worldview. And to say I'm racist does not fit well with a lot of people. But yet, it is the reason for a lot of their hatred for Obama, for their perceptions of a lot of these other things going on. It's there. So, can you access that? Can you talk to that bias? Sometimes not, I don't know.
So you mentioned a lot of the biases and cognitive difficulties that go on in some of the science that happens, but
the premier basis of science is the scientific method, okay, which seeks to remove a lot of that bias. But on top of that, there's publication, there's critical review by peers, there's repeatability that seeks to remove a lot of that, what we understand and what scientists understand as biases. So is your criticism of science really warranted, or are you really criticizing science?
I'm not criticizing science, I'm criticizing scientists. And in fact, thank you for bringing that up. I don't know if it was, you go to Wikipedia and you look up cognitive biases, and at the bottom, of course, there's all the citations for the information that they put into the Wikipedia article. And I think it was there where they talked about this bias that scientists have. And I gave you one example, but there's many studies out there that talk about the issues about evaluations of scientific literature. So in this, as many of you know, in the scientific literature, there's this review committee. You submit a paper, it gets reviewed, they decide whether to publish it in their magazine or not, right? And so they've looked at the bias issues there, and of course, if your paper tends to be supportive of the bias of the reviewer, your paper gets in there, more likely. And they've looked at this. So, is this a surprise? Perhaps not. But yeah, you have to at least recognize the fact that scientists are people. And I can also tell you, and some of you who've been coming here, I gave my first talk here in December, and about biology of religion. And I only bring it up because I've had discussions with professors, with people in academics, and I've tried to present my theory to them, and I can tell you, they rejected it. Not everybody, but a lot of people do, and not based on the evidence. In fact, there's one guy who's relatively well known in the scientific community and has published quite a bit, who said one thing in papers that he published, and when I used his own words, I hate to say it against him, but in the argument, I cited his own stuff. He denied. He didn't deny that he said it, but he basically denied the point that I was making based on his own words. I was like flabbergasted. You gotta be kidding me. You're denying it because you don't, well, maybe he doesn't want to have the argument with me in the first place. But, I mean, if you're really serious about having this debate, how can you say opposite of what you wrote in this paper and published? Blew me away. Brian. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is directly related to consciousness, but I've read some things about people who have brain injuries and suddenly they have capabilities, expertise in mathematics or languages or things like that they've never learned, and yet is suddenly there. And then of course there's also like savants. And can you comment on that and how it relates perhaps to consciousness?
Well, certainly Oliver Sacks is a well-known author who's talked about that, at least in terms of music and perhaps some other things, but certainly in music. He's talked about people who get a brain injury and suddenly they become this musical savant out of nowhere. It's incredible. But what it really talks to me about is the brain, the way the brain is wired, and the way that all these brain modules, I mentioned Brokaw's area, Wernicke's area, these are sort of the classic brain modules having to do with speech. If you get damage in those areas, you get aphasia, which is there's different kinds of aphasias, but you lose the ability to talk or to understand, or there's different, depending on what kind of brain damage you have. It shows that these modular areas of the brain control what goes on. And just like that blind sight thing, where the guy has all the parts working except the part that delivers the visual message to consciousness, what we think is consciousness. So, yeah, I mean, there's the Rain Man movie and Sheldon Cooper on Big Bang and all these people who have what we would say is sort of a kind of, what's the thing that they have? Asperger's, or the greater thing is called autism. Thank you. I guess my brain is losing some of it. So they have autism, yet some of these, like in Rain Man, based on supposedly real people, have these incredible abilities. So there's just, there's this other thing called synesthesia. Who knows synesthesia? Yeah, good. So this is where people associate, say, numbers with colors, for example, or they basically take two different modalities and they associate them together. There's one guy who I believe is borderline autistic, who's one of these mathematical savants, but he's social enough, shall we say, that he can actually have a good conversation with you, and he talks about how when people ask him these mathematical questions to these incredible math feats that most of us are unable to do, he talks about how he sees it in color. And somehow, that color becomes the answer. No one knows how that works. He doesn't know how that works. It just happens, and it all happens below consciousness. Most of what happens is below consciousness.
So I want to avoid a semantic discussion on this, but in your first slide, you kind of went over what consciousness means with appropriate definition and then some bullet points. And I guess my biggest question is if you're familiar with the sort of argument that has gone on between Sam Harris and Dan Dennett over free will and how that relates to consciousness. I think my primary question would be, you seem to suggest that consciousness was something that differentiated humans from other animals in some degree. And I guess after seeing the rest of your presentation, I would wonder where the place of consciousness is, if you think we're sort of structured on this belief that's already there, or it seemed to suggest that some of this was almost instinctual to us, that it's something below our consciousness that we're not having a higher understanding of. And I was wondering if you could sort of comment on that. Where is the place for consciousness in humans, and where does that arise in our decision-making process? Is it compatible, or is it Dennett's compatibilism, comparatively?
The short answer is no one really knows. It's brutal. I look at this stuff, and every day it's like, this can't be right. I'm the master of my own ship. I make my own decisions. And yet, you look at the science, I don't know. Let me just talk about free will for a second, since you mentioned it. To me, free will is like God. It's a creation of the human brain. Does it exist? Well, here in this room, certainly not. Whether or not you happen to believe free will exists, different story, but it's a philosophical concept. The science of free will, I don't know what that means. This is the science. This tells you what actually happens. And then the philosophers over thousands of years talk about free will. We have it, we don't have it, we have this much, we don't, Everybody, all the philosophers have opinions. It's all wonderful to read in philosophy 101 in college, and then it's like, not that I chose science myself, but you also talked about, does consciousness really exist? And that is an excellent question. So in the beginning, one of the first slides was sort of listing what the pitfalls or downsides of consciousness was. I pretty much took that from an article by Baumeister and whatever. I can find them for you. I don't think I put them up there. But they listed very succinctly the pitfalls of consciousness, and they suggest, they say that there are scientists who do claim that there is no such thing as consciousness, that it has no impact on humanity. I can't believe that. And in fact, I didn't present it tonight. There's so much to talk about, but there is, I think, good evidence that consciousness does exist and it has an impact. So, the scientists don't know. They can't even define what consciousness is. They can't even define a lot of how the human brain works. It's all a big mystery. You know, how is it that we can detect the world around us, the sensory input? You know, there's this whole business, so you mentioned Dan Dennett. There's this big debate about how do we, and there's actually a guy I think who wrote a book about some seeing red or the sense of red. How do we see the color red? How does it actually work? How do we sense that redness exists? We can talk about the cones in the eyes and all this stuff, but at a certain point, it's got to be deeper in the brain. How is that interpreted? Because we know that the eye delivers a message back to the occipital lobe where the visual cortex is, and it's there where all those inputs get munged together. And so that you can see lines like this and lines like this. So they've done experiments on cats, for instance, kittens, where they have the ability to put these lenses, poor cats, on these kittens that only show up and down. So they can only see vertical lines. The lenses restrict their vision. And what happens is in the occipital lobe in the back, that part that would see the horizontal stuff decays because there's no input to that. And after a certain point in the kitten's life, you take the glasses off, they can't see horizontal anymore. They're just examples of the kinds of stuff they do, you know?
Well, I think we'll just cut it there. And Mitch is around for questions after the fact, but I just figured we'll wrap it up right now. But thank you so much for just giving us.